My name, for those of you who don't know, is Austin Williams. I'm the director of the Future Cities Project. And this is, in some ways, the first Bookshop Barney for a while, the first international Bookshop Barney. So it's a good evening from the UK, it's a good morning in California, and it's good grief if you're awake in China. We're here to discuss Joel's book, Joel Kotkin's book, which is The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, a warning to the global middle class. It doesn't matter if you haven't read it yet, Joel is here to convince you. Just to say, just as an aside, we have readers groups for any of you who are interested. On the 10th of February, we have the only non-fiction readers group in the country, I would argue, where we're discussing Anne Applebaum's book, The Twilight of Democracy. And on the 18th of February, 1 month's time, we're coming back again for a new Bookshop Barney, which is with Michael Schellenberger, who is also in America, who will be discussing Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. He's an environmentalist, but he's a critical environmentalist, so that should be quite lively. So the purpose of the Barney is to give the author opportunity to convince you to read it. And if you've already read it, then obviously just shows how easily manipulated you are by advertising. It's a great read, thoroughly recommended. It's a great gift. Remember, there's only 11 months till Christmas. And if the lockdown continues, that's only about 20 shopping days. So buy early. We'll keep the Amazon link up occasionally for you to click through if you so wish. And a few days ago, I was only thinking that a few days ago, if I was to kind of tell you that I was going to introduce an orange presidential fellow, you might not have come along, but you know, those days are gone. Tonight we have Joel Kotkin, who is the Orange County Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at Chapman University, and he's zooming in from California. He's been described as America's Uber geographer, which doesn't mean that he draws maps for taxi drivers, but he's an internationally recognized authority on urbanism, on global economic, political, and social trends. And he's written more than 8 or so books. He's written lots of influential papers and articles, so like the City Journal. And he's the executive editor of the widely read website, newgeography.com, newgeography, all one word.com. Take a look. So yes, this book, The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, is a terrific read. Some might ask, obviously some have asked, why write a book? Why we're discussing a book on feudalism? After all, that was another era, you know, when ordinary people were confined in their local areas, when they lived unproductive lives, when they were ruled by decree, when they knew their place. What could possibly that have to do with today, they ask. I'll leave that one to mull that one over. But Quillette says that this book is timely, compelling, and well written. Counterpunch says that it's fundamentally unsound. This conversation is for you to decide if you're going to sit on the fence or take a position. But for me, it's ultimately a book about democracy. It's a defense of democracy, and all the more important for that. It's a cracking read. The Bookshop Barney is where you make your mind up on issues and where you put forward your own comments and questions. But the idea is that we explore the ideas in a bit more of a forensic style than you might do in a normal book presentation. So Joel has kindly agreed to do 5 or 6 minutes or so just to kind of talk you through the general theme of the book, to try to inspire you to kind of think about some of the broader issues. I'm going to ask then 4 or 5 questions. From my reading of the book, I'll draw out some of those things to give Joel another bite of the cherry, for him to kind of explore some of those ideas more. And then it's out to you in the audience to come in, like I say, for questions, but also for comments and what have you. So if we can just unmute and give Joel a roaring UK or world global round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel. It's always good to get the applause in first, Joel, I find. So please welcome Joel Kotkin live from California to convince us of the benefits of this book. Joel, over to you.
All right, thank you, Austin. You know, one of the reasons I wrote this book was as much descriptive as also as a warning. You know, we've been brought up with this idea that history is always going in the direction towards greater rationality, greater progress, greater material gain, greater technology. And the reality is that may not be the case. And we know in history that there have been periods where we regressed. And I think we are on the verge of a serious regression. And I'm going to go into some of the ways I make that point. First and foremost is the inequality. Like the feudal era, there's a diminishing middle class pretty much throughout the world, particularly in Europe and North America, and a growing concentration of power in small hands. The House of Commons estimates about 1% of the top earners now control something close to 50% of the world's wealth, and now they figure by 2030 it will be almost 2/3. The pandemic, and we can certainly discuss that, has accelerated that, made hundreds of thousands of small shopkeepers everywhere throughout the high income world, basically driven them out of business and into penury, out of the middle class, while Jeff Bezos gets richer every day. And the tech oligarchs, I think now drunk with almost unlimited power, are now essentially doing a hostile takeover of the US Constitution, which as an American, I'm not very happy about. But this is a kind of power this is what I would call the oligarchical class. Somewhat Wall Street, but Wall Street is inevitably really second rate to the tech oligarchs. You would really have 5, at best 7 companies who, outside of China, dominate the world economy, dominate the financial markets in ways that we really haven't seen in at least a century. So that's one thing. You have a concentration of wealth, a concentration of power, concentration of land ownership. I was just on a call where apparently Bill Gates is now the largest owner of farmland in the United States. I'm sure that makes us all happy. And so you have this oligarchical class, which really is where the power is concentrated. But their power is met with what I call the clerisy. The clerisy is, if you did your French history, the old first estate in France, whereas the church determined what people thought, what was acceptable, dominated the education system, and really sort of also played a nice role of allowing the aristocrats to do horrible things and then get penance by building part of a church. This is another very powerful class, and they have done remarkably well, particularly at the upper end, what you might call the upper end of the nomenclatura in the old Soviet Union. And this group, it doesn't always agree. Sometimes there are some conflicts with the oligarchs, but they work together, and the oligarchs fund the nonprofits that these clerics belong to. So, you know, when Jeff Bezos, I don't mean to pick on Jeff, but I will, give us, $10 billion to the green establishment, they now have enormous resources to do things. Black Lives Matter also getting enormous amounts of funding from these groups. So the clerisy has moved up, and the part of the non-super rich who have done well have generally been the clerisy. University professors, certainly not their adjuncts, university professors, medical experts, high-end lawyers. These are people who have actually done reasonably well. The third group, what I call the Yeomanry, is really the old middle class. And that middle class is largely small business owners, artisans, people who have, some property, but not a great deal of property. And they, as I argue in the book, were the bulwark of the middle class and the democratic revolutions that took place in the 18th and 19th century. They are the one group that is independent, relatively independent. And of course, they've been very tied to the idea of home ownership, family, very critical in the growth of religion. And this group is being squeezed, as the OECD points out, virtually everywhere in the world, and even now increasingly in China, which had an enormous increase in its middle class, but that's beginning to change as well. But certainly in Europe, in the United States, in Canada. And this is really important because even what we consider to be egalitarian societies, like Canada, my wife's from Canada, has become increasingly hierarchical with increasing concentrations of wealth and power. The group that's growing is what I would call the serfs. And the serfs are very often people who would have been in the middle class at one time. They would have started a business. They would have bought a house. But under the current circumstances, under the regulatory regime, under the competition of the tech oligarchs, under the way that Wall Street allocates capital, it is very difficult for them. And so what we see is a society which is very, very, very divided by these classes. And what is most frightening is my adopted home state of California. I came here in 1971. And it was the land of opportunity. You came from all over the world, all over the country. This is where you could make it. And you didn't need a PhD. You didn't need to be from a wealthy family. People came, they prospered, they created a huge homeowning class. That was the California I came to. Lots of economic opportunities of different kinds. But on the other hand, now California has the highest rate of poverty in the United States if you adjust for income. We have about a third of all the welfare recipients. Our two great cities, Los Angeles and San Francisco, have become essentially pockmarked with homeless encampments, very high rates of poverty that are, and we see this happening more and more. So California, which was really sort of America cubed, sort of the, has, as it has become more dominated by the tech oligarchs, has become increasingly unequal. And by the way, other industries in the state which don't have political power have been leaving. Manufacturing, logistics, good blue collar jobs have disappeared. So what I really am concerned about, sort of to take the old term from the early history of the Soviet Union, when I believe maybe it was Max Eastman who said, I've seen the future and it works. Well, maybe I can say from California, I've seen the future and it's pretty dystopic. So I'll leave it with that. Hopefully I stimulated a few thoughts.
Very good, Joel. Thank you very much. Didn't exactly end on a high, but I think it's quite important that you have this kind of just general thread of, I don't know, there's telling a real story throughout the book. So it's important that we have a negative point of view as well as some kind of positive ones. But I just wanted to address, there's a lot of things you just mentioned there, which I'll leave some of that to the audience to come back on. I just wanted to go through the book particularly. I'm going to start at the very end, if you don't mind. You end with a quote by R.H. Tawney, British historian, where he says, "Happy is the nation whose people have not forgotten how to rebel." So I just, given the events of the last week or so, I just wondered whether that made a happy situation for you, or whether you were equally disturbed as the press seemed to be. What do you make of what's happened in the last week?
Well, I think there are two things. I think that what we have in America, because, obviously what happened in the Capitol was terrible, and, President Trump should, be impeached. I mean, I have no sympathy at all for him, even though I agreed with some of his policies. I always thought he was a very inappropriate person to be president. I think he'd be inappropriate to run the corner store, but that's another story. But what has happened, you have to look at it as this summer, there was one millennial riot, and now there was another millennial riot. So what we have to ask ourselves is, why do we have a class of people who don't believe in the basic institutions of society and of the American Republic? Why are they so angry? And I think in the work that I talk about in the book, and in many of the other projects I've done, and not just here in the US, the millennial generation is what I call the screwed generation. They are unable to buy a house. They've been brought up in an education system that doesn't teach them useful skills and certainly doesn't teach them the discipline they need to succeed in the world. They are being constantly told the world is coming to the end. You know, Saint Greta says, you know, in 2 weeks, the world will come to an end. I mean, by the way, you're having my friend Mike Schellenberger, and Mike really does a great job of spelling this out. But there's something very almost medieval in this kind of atmosphere of fear, atmosphere that the world is coming to an end, or the notion this summer that that anybody who doesn't agree with Black Lives Matter is a inveterate racist and you know should be dismissed from school. I mean, literally, I don't know how many of you teach in the school today, but if you teach, if you're in publishing, you live with fear now in a way that you never thought. Because look, I agree that Alex Jones, you know, I'm not going to defend Alex Jones, and I'm not going to defend, you know, Donald Trump and stop the steal. I mean, but although I don't think that they need to be silenced, they, you know, they're, you know, the truth will win out over time, and it's not a good strategy. But fundamentally, what we're seeing is a growth of a whole generation. And by the way, not just here, you see it in Europe, you see it in Australia, who are completely alienated. And there are two variants. So I would say the riots this summer and what happened in Washington are just different sides of the same coin. The only difference is if the far left wants to duke it out with the far right, they'll get their asses kicked because the far right is much better armed. But I do worry that we could be headed to something like happened in Weimar Germany, where the communists and the Nazis fight it out on the streets. This is not what America is about. It's not our tradition. But I think what is also not our tradition, and I'll sum it up this way, this is the first generation in American history that will live worse than their parents. And particularly if you're in New York or California, one way people are able to get around it is they move to a less expensive part of the country. The beauty of America, and same thing can be said of Australia for sure, and Canada. It's a big country and you can move somewhere else to improve your conditions. But fundamentally, this is an angry generation who are complete. So instead of protesting the way we're supposed to protest, that they reject all the standards.
Okay. Well, I mean, again, you've covered a lot, which, in as much as, you know, this whole idea about, by the way, I see people have got like their little blue hands up. If you can just bear with us while we explore some of these ideas, and then I'll bring you all in bulk at the end. It'll be about 20 minutes or so. The clerisy, you know, this kind of right-thinking opinion formers from universities, the arts, tech sector that you talk about, and you explore that very well. And you've just kind of gone into that idea about whether it's censoriousness or, as Twitter has just said, you know, it's a private platform, therefore we can decide who comes on it or not. It's not censorious. It's just a kind of a business decision. But I just wondered that, having seen Rudy Giuliani speak yesterday with the title of his little broadcast called "The Tech Oligarchs Are Taking Control of Our Country," there's a rise of kind of conspiratorial thinking, QAnon and all the rest of it. And then there's you saying the same words but meaning something different. I was just wondering how do you balance what you say so you don't sound like a lunatic?
Well, first, I base everything in history. I started covering Silicon Valley in 1975. So these aren't, first of all, the initial Silicon Valley was made up of engineers, a lot of them from the Midwest, very solid people, no great pretensions that they knew where societies should go. And over time, these tech oligarchs have changed. They've become more arrogant, more feeling that they have a right to tell people what to do. And one of the things that the head of the Bay Area Council, the leading business organization in the Bay Area, told me, he says, these companies are also scared of their own employees. that now look, my experience with nerds, which is pretty extensive, most of them are pretty apolitical, but the ones who are political and the ones who, let's say, work in the HR departments and the public relations department are very political. So they are driving this agenda. We have to remember Silicon Valley in 1980s and even into the 90s was very sort of moderate Republican, was a big part of it. The Congress people were from the center of the Republican Party, never the Trumpist types, but always, sort of more moderate Republicans, independents, and moderate Democrats. And by moderate, today you almost can use the word sane. But this has changed. As they have become more powerful, they have become more convinced that they know the answer. And the terrible thing is, it's not that they're bad people. I mean, Giuliani really, he should really talk to a psychiatrist or something. Because I think he's done a terrible job to his own legacy. But this idea, I've been writing about this tech oligarch issue for years and years and years. The danger is that these people now are not so powerful. You look at the Obama administration, now the Biden administration, filled with people with financial and employment ties to the tech oligarchs. And they are completely convinced of their power. So I'm going to give you the perfect example of this. The site Parler, which I've never been on, and I'm sure there are some bad people on it, but as there are some very bad people on Facebook that nobody seems to be getting rid of. But they what was the coup de grace was when Amazon cut their access to the cloud. And guess what happens? The next day, there's an editorial in the Washington Post saying, "What a great move." Who owns the Washington Post? The guy who controls Amazon. So what you've got is this incredibly incestuous group of people who live in their own world. I'll give you one last example. State of California, we have one of the highest unemployment rates in the country now. We have a terrible issue in terms of poverty, expensive housing. I can go on and on. Terrible education. Gavin Newsom says, "Wow, what's the problem? We have all these IPOs and the ultra rich are richer than ever." This shows you where, unfortunately, as a lifelong Democrat, the Democratic Party has gone. It's become the party of oligarchs, and this is really it's not a conspiracy. When people talk about conspiracies, I always make the point: people are too stupid to have conspiracies. They're too selfish. They fight each other. They're self-centered. I don't think that they sit there and it's not like the Trotsky working in the Soviet. And by the way, there was more good luck involved with that than anything else. But that's a whole nother story. But the key thing is that we now have people acting in what they see their self-interest, reflecting the cultural mores of their activist employees, reflecting the politics. Remember that two of the most, in quote, progressive places in America, the Bay Area and the Puget Sound, dominate the world tech economy outside of China. So I think that to say it's a conspiracy, it gives them too much credit. I think they're reflecting their class and regional biases. And obviously, the other thing that, as Google, for instance, is increasingly politicizing its search engine, it also is increasingly favoring those people who, guess what, advertise through Google.
Well, look, okay, we move away from conspiracies, maybe. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the voice of liberal democracy in some people's eyes, has argued just the day before yesterday, argued that the federal government should rein in our media, that disinformation, whatever that means, should be suppressed. So that idea that the First Amendment rights, which have been around for quite some time, free speech, freedom of assembly, and what have you. They've come to be seen as a danger to a free society. It's quite an interesting turnabout. So what you described, I think, is a very interesting kind of surrounding to this conversation. But obviously, it does beg the question as to why it's happened. How has it happened, especially in such a seemingly swift period? So what's going on when freedom is seen to be hateful and suppression is meant to be an expression of freedom?
Well, I think there are a couple things. First of all, and I don't know if this is the same true in Britain as well. Kids don't know anything about American history or the Constitution. If anything, they're fed with misinformation. Talk about misinformation. 1619 is one of the most. The idea that the United States was founded as a slave society, that drove our economy. Well, I don't know. Somebody ought to tell the Southern generals who got their asses kicked in the war because the North had many more people, had much more wealth, had much more industry and technology, as Marx wrote about actually quite well. So the reality is that we really have a situation where many people are thinking that there may be a conspiracy. They may think that these things are happening purposely, but they're really happening because they're in the interest of people, and because this is really important as a person who's taught for many years. Kids, particularly the millennials, were brought up to say, no, bad thoughts should not be allowed. If somebody disagrees with me, it's a threat. I had a student, a very nice student, a woman, half French, half African American, who said, I feel unsafe because Ben Shapiro is speaking on campus. And I said, well, why would you feel that way? You just don't have to go listen to him. Well, because he's a racist. I mean, it's like this idea that if you don't buy the agenda of, let's say, Black Lives Matter, you're a racist. I had a student say this to me yesterday. Well, if you begin to say, okay, somebody disagree with me is a racist, and therefore they should not be employed by the university, they should be knocked off the editorial pages of the New York Times. That whole generation, and I think a lot of it has to go back to postmodernist theory, the idea of narrative, that there is no universal truth, that there is no inherent advantage to free speech and dialogue. And the contrast I felt, that I did a program, Wednesday night my time, Thursday morning their time in Singapore, and the other speaker besides me was the ambassador to Algeria from Singapore, and he said a successful society has to be particularly if it's multiracial, has to be a dialoguing society. You have to be able to have conversation. The problem is that we now have a group of academic Leninists whose view is that we have to suppress speech in order to produce a certain kind of person with a certain kind of view. And it's become rife. And the AOCs of the world, I understand she has a degree in economics. I don't know what economics she's learning, because her ideas are ludicrous and terribly destructive to the working class in particular. But the fact is that the value of free speech is just not there. It just isn't there. I mean, in ways that my grandparents, who came to America from Russia, would never have understood. I mean, or my mother-in-law, who survived World War II, hidden in a convent. She would never understand how people can say that if somebody disagrees with me, they're not only wrong, they're evil. And not only are they evil, but they should be banned from the internet, banned from teaching, banned from writing. I mean, what we're talking about is the creation of a digital gulag, where you'll be able to type something up and send it like a samizdat to your friends, but you won't be able to put it on any major social media. And my colleague Mike Lind has made a very good point that we need to apply to the internet the same rules that we have for accommodations, for hotels, for who can get on a train. Can you imagine a situation where you can't get on a train because you have the wrong point of view? These platforms have become public conveyances and have to be regulated in that sense, or
Yeah, but
allowed for more competition.
yeah, well, I mean, just on this point, just to kind of, I suppose, dig down a little bit more onto it, but reasonably quickly, because you say that the clerisy that we've now identified, or the tech overlords, or whatever you want to call it, are engineering illiteracy. Engineering, that what you just talked about, the unknown history and all the rest of it, and there's a truth to that. Although there's also a kind of a curious a paradox with the fact that actually this kind of technology has opened up all the literature of the world to everybody. So how that kind of plays out. So is it more a question of government failure to, in some way, kind of drive a narrative or an educational policy, which the tech giants are responding to? Or is it, as you were saying, are the tech giants in control of this narrative? Or is it a failure of government, is what I'm trying to say?
I think it's both. I think it's a failure of government, certainly in education, to teach the basic principles of what made the UK or the US or Canada or Australia, places that people want to move to. Certainly the education system, which at least in parts of the country, particularly here in California, has really been taken over by, sort of postmodernist, they like to call themselves Marxists, but as somebody who studied Marx, I sort of doubt it. I don't really take their, I think Marx would retch if he heard what these people were saying. But more to the point, and by the way, Marxist historians dismiss 1619 as much as anyone else. But there also is sort of this tech oligarch mentality. I have a good friend who's was the largest apartment builder in Silicon Valley. Very distinguished businessman, former mayor, a Democrat. And he said to me, he said, I have never met a group of people, talking about the tech oligarchs, who have less consciousness of the impact of what they're doing than the tech people. He said, frankly, I can work with an oil company executive and they understand what the consequences of what they're doing are, whether or not there's enough housing, should we locate in a particular place. He said, these are people who are oblivious to history, oblivious to sociology, oblivious to what the impact of what they're doing is. And the last part of it is that the technology itself, because we don't ask people to read anymore, means that their brains are atrophying. There's something about picking up a book. Now, I'm an author, so I'm prejudiced, but picking up a book and having to think about it. You're reading a section of a book and you start thinking, novel or fiction or nonfiction, your brain is coming up with, oh, what is the image of that? What does that look like? That is an enormously useful mental exercise. That's now replaced with clicking on Google. So if I ask somebody, okay, what was the policy in terms of religious freedom in the Middle Ages? I go to Google, I get an article, I take the first paragraph of that article. Do I sit there and read Max Weber? Do I sit there and read Mill? Do I read Marx? Do I read Tocqueville? So all the great work that we've had is literally disappearing. And by the way, not only here, I strongly urge you at some point to have a session on Chinese science fiction, because it tells you where they think that world is going. And I can tell you, the Chinese classics don't do any better than Alexander Hamilton.
I agree with you on that. Just in terms of having a critical engagement with ideas, I thought your section on environmentalism, which I'll just throw in, was very interesting because instead of it being high tech and authoritarian, it's actually kind of quite low tech, and people think it's got nothing to do with politics. It's non-political for some people, isn't it? But you point out that environmentalism has led to the revival of the notion of poverty as a virtue. The
Yes.
idea that austerity in some ways is a moral good. So that bit, you're critical of the idea of frugality. But then towards the end of the book, I thought it was interesting because you seem to suggest, correct me if I'm wrong, that environmentalism might be a way out, because you said, quotes, young activists may not tolerate the oligarchy's excesses as did earlier generations of environmental campaigners. So you're trying to say, Prince Charles, Richard Branson, people get a little bit pissed off by being talked down to by them. But it is kind of exposing hypocrisy of the elites. Is that enough, or does that actually sometimes reinforce the very
Well,
thing that you're
certainly the
critical of?
hypocrisy is pretty there. I don't know if I want your prince. I guess he's still a prince,
Yeah.
and Miss Markle to tell me that I shouldn't drive and I should live in an apartment and I should take the bus to work when they're living in what 24,000 square feet in Santa Barbara. I probably couldn't afford their garage. The idea that I'm being told by my favorite image is Davos, where there were so many private jets that they couldn't park them all. I spoke at an environment conference in Santa Barbara, actually, sponsored by I was with Bjorn Lundberg, and it was in Santa Barbara, and about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And I asked the organizer, how are people getting here? A lot of them were from Silicon Valley. They were all taking their private jets. By the way, it's a 4-hour drive to Santa Barbara. It's a gorgeous drive. It's a pleasant drive. There's not a lot of traffic, but they had to take their private jets. So, I don't have anything against people having wealth. And I think this is the Achilles heel of the oligarchs. But I don't like being told that I have to live more modestly while they live outrageously. I think that is a real problem. And I would link this to what I find a very scary thing, and I assume it's come up in the UK as well, because actually the one thing I'll say for your Greens is they're equally insane, but they're more honest. This idea of the Great Reset, that we should go, that in the future, we're going to give up on economic growth. Now, I don't say economic growth is the solution, but economic growth that only helps asset inflation is not a good thing. But economic growth that allows for opportunity, for upward mobility, for a higher standard of living, I'm certainly in favor of that. And what frightens me is we now have a group of corporate oligarchs who want to impose austerity on everyone else while they live well. And of course, the medieval analogy is quite good, because the bishops of the Catholic Church and the aristocrats would say, isn't it great? Poverty, people aren't, literally sometimes we even have people say that Dharavi in Mumbai is the ideal of where we want to go. But I don't think Leonardo DiCaprio is going to move to Dharavi. So what you see is this incredible period of hypocrisy that is equal to what you had in the Middle Ages. The good part is, and we're doing this here in California, we're beginning to talk to people on the left and saying, are you sure that it's good for working class people to pay 3 times more for energy than they do in another state? Do you think it's good for here in California that the unionized construction worker not one can afford a median price house in any of the counties in the coast of California? Do you think that's good? You think that's social justice? And I think what you have to do is you have to expose the contradictions and then begin to provide alternatives.
Very good, very good. All right, Joel, I had a question about Brexit, which you had under the chapter heading "The Peasants' Rebellion," which I thought was great.
Yeah.
But I'll just float that out there in case anybody else wants to pick up on it. That was terrific stuff, Joel, as I expected. Can we take the questions in, or not just questions, like I say, comments, but don't over-labor your opportunity to speak at length. I'll take you in order if that's all right. Let me just quickly skim down who we have here. So Nancy's first up.
Right.
Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Okay. My question comment was about inequality. and whether we need a better way of talking about this, because I absolutely agree that it is a problem that wealth and power are being concentrated in the hands of a few. But there is this discussion of inequality, which I think is really more of a discussion of entitlement. And what strikes me is things like AOC and and her kind of ilk's discussion of universal basic income, and this idea that that what we should be aiming for is for some sort of caretaking of people, so that they get their universal basic income, they're homeless, they get their tiny house, they live in their tiny house, and the really disturbing thing about it is that I think we have a couple of generations now that have a very different moral outlook, which is based on a therapeutic understanding of the point of life. So, you can see that there are some people who, they want to have their life coach and their universal basic income, and that's how they want to live their life. And I just feel that we need to find some sort of way to promote the adult aspiration to shape the world around you. No guarantees, but the ability to determine your own future. So I wondered, if that's something that you've thought about, and if anybody had any good ideas of ways we could do this.
Well,
I
bring up.
Joel, can
Yes?
I chip in rudely from the chair? If it's feasible that we can take maybe 2 or 3 or so questions, the reason for doing that is because time is short. Your time is short.
Okay, so I'm
but
just
also,
going to write them down.
scribble a bit of paper. And it's also the fact that maybe there's a question that you couldn't care less about answering, and you want to skip over it.
So you want to do 2 more questions, and then
2
I'll
more
answer
questions,
all?
and then and just in case there's a theme, you might want to just cover
Sure.
it that way. Yeah, that's right. Okay, good man. Gareth, you're next, please. Gareth Stern.
Hi, Joel. Thank you so much for that. I'm really fascinated in your work. I've just been reading Michael Lind, whom, of course, you mentioned earlier on, and David Goodhart's work in this country.
Both friends, yes.
They I'm not surprised. They both make the argument that the education system has turned into one of the prime ways that the membership of the clerisy is kind of validated. It's the gatekeeper in, and you've already sort of mentioned where you think some of the places the education system may have gone wrong. At the same time, the clerisy and the oligarchs are very good at pointing to the lack of education of the serfs as a reason why the decisions they make are so bad and so on. And big tech is really, really interested in the education system. So I wondered if you might have any ideas on how you think the education system might be rehabilitated. Do you think it can be reconstituted? Is it a lost cause now? And particularly this idea about, should the classroom be politics free now, or is there a way of bringing politics in that doesn't politicize the classroom? The teacher can talk about it without instantly creating a whole fuss and probably getting themselves in a lot of trouble. I wondered if you had any views on that.
Sure.
Okay, Joel, hold hard. We'll do one more. Just here's me assuming there might be a theme, but there isn't. There's 3 separate questions. But we have Daniel, please. Daniel Penamy.
Okay, well, this is a theme, Austin, so you'll be happy, because my question follows on from what Nancy was asking, which is about what you might call the paradox of inequality. Because it seems to me, Joel, you're absolutely right to argue, at least within the Western countries, you can make a strong argument there is widening inequality between the very rich and the rest of society. I think that's true. But what also seems to me to be a strong trend is that both the very wealthy and what you call the clerisy are really, really concerned about inequality. And they keep on saying, we've got to do something to stop this inequality. So just one example that really strikes me, if you think about the Davos, like World Economic Forum conferences on the top of the Swiss mountaintop, you get all of these, both the plutocrats and clericy people coming along, really, really wealthy people or very powerful people. And yet the people who are the beneficiaries of inequality keep on saying, well, we've got to do something about it. We've got to somehow contain it and control it. So how do you explain this paradox?
Okay, thank you. Yes, please, Joe.
Can I go ahead now, Austin?
Yes, please.
Okay. I think actually the first and third questions, I think, hit at something very similar. The question really is, in terms of inequality, is how do you address inequality? I see the lack of upward mobility as the biggest problem. And what the universal basic income approach, which by the way, a lot of the oligarchs support, is this idea that, well, we're going to pay people enough so they don't, first of all, they don't come with pitchforks and do to us what happened in Britain during some of the peasant rebellions that I write about, and even worse ones in Russia and France. But also it's a way of sort of solving the problem of no entrepreneurial opportunity. It supports the idea that you don't have an economy that generates new small businesses and innovation. Everything's controlled from the top, and you basically, it's what the Marx called the proletarian alms bag. We just buy everyone off. Now, what scares me the most about that, and this relates to the comment about adulthood, is that what we're saying to young people is, don't worry about buying a house. Don't worry about starting a business. Don't worry about having a family. We'll give you $2,000 a month. You can play as many video games as you want. You can, smoke pot, drink, whatever it is that you like to do. You don't get married. You don't have kids. You live in a little apartment and you water your plants. That's basically sort of where they're going. And you see some of this even without UBI in countries like Japan, where young people, they don't date, they don't have sex, they play video games all day. Actually, their sex life is mostly on the cyber side. I know Austin's worked in Asia too. The young Asian men are a very different group than the older Asian men. And obviously there's some things that may be better in terms of their attitudes, but this idea of you forestall ever accepting any responsibility. And this reflects my beliefs on millennials. If millennials feel they're never going to get anywhere, why won't you vote for a universal basic income? Why wouldn't you support the idea that college is free, and even if it's completely and totally irrelevant, but then you get your degree and I guess your parents are happy and maybe you get a job as a receptionist, although I don't know if there are receptionists anymore. But the reality is, it is a way of creating a society which will be have incredibly low fertility rates, and in which the entrepreneurial grassroots economy is basically goes underground, is basically quite small. So I think these are connected. And then that leads me a little bit to the whole question of education. And this is something I've been talking with my president of Chapman, who is an Italian mathematician and has really been very good on the free speech issue. But I'm beginning to wonder whether the university system as constituted, as we get rid of the old academics and we replace them with much more woke, much more limited, and I have to say, in terms of the English language, these are the people who probably have done more to slaughter the English language than any group of illiterates could ever hope to achieve. I mean, as I've written 10 books now, and I find every year I get less and less and less out of academic studies. Because they're very often politically correct and slanted, but also because they're just not written in English. They're written in some other language, not sure what it is. So I think we're probably going to have to start looking at alternative systems of education. And the one good thing about what we're doing today and what Zooms are doing is allowing people to access thoughtful, important speakers instead of listening to some person who got a degree in, women's history from 1852 to 1853. And boy, that person knows more about that than anybody. But if you ask them who was Fernand Braudel, they couldn't tell you. So I think we're going to have to see a change. And I just did a piece for Quillette, which is one of my favorite publications, which is actually based out of Australia. And what we found is in religion that there is a real increase in the audience for religious studies that's online. But it doesn't mean that you have to listen to your local imam or your local priest or pastor or rabbi. You can go and directly access really, really interesting, provocative thinkers. So I think there's going to have to be some change. The other thing is at the particularly K through 12 level, two issues. One, I agree you can't avoid politics, but it should be more in the case of civics. Let's learn why the Electoral College was there. I had one student of mine after the 2016 election said to me, my professor said the Electoral College was created to protect slavery. And I said, well, do you know which state proposed the Electoral College? It was a state called Connecticut. Connecticut was one of the first free states. What state opposed it? Virginia. It was the biggest state. It happened to be a big slave state. So it was all an issue. And I'm not going to bore you with American history, but just to say basically, the big concern of the small states, the Rhode Islands, the South Carolinas, the Connecticut's, was that they would be overwhelmed by a few big states. And the way that they're being taught, another teacher in my wife's book group said the police were there to catch slaves. That's why we had professional police. I said, well, what does it explain the origins of the British bobbies or the cops in Boston? I mean, did you ever see the gangs of New York? I think New York needed a police department. I don't think it had anything to do with catching slaves. So if we could teach sort of the basics of history, you don't have to go back to the kind of history that existed in the past where we didn't deal with African Americans and we didn't deal with slavery and we didn't deal enough with what happened to the Native Americans. That can be included as part of the tapestry of our history, just like the UK. You have many things to be proud of, and there are many negatives, but you don't just do the negatives, and you want to have what one historian called the usable past. So that's one big part of it, and the last part is skills education. Many states in the country, in the middle of the country, are emphasizing, how do we teach people to be plumbers? How do we teach people to be electricians? How do we get them to do a numerical, a computer-controlled machine tool? The basic business skills. And you know what? I have yet to find a chamber of commerce in this country that says, you know what the problem is? We don't have enough postmodernist English professors. And if we could only have more of them, our economy would do great.
Cheers, Joel. Look, eloquent and humorous as you are, I'm gonna cut you shorter next time, and I'm gonna also now, because there's quite a few hands up, I'm gonna take 5 questions. Again, you can be dismissive with your red pen, but again, can the questions or comments be reasonably pointed? Kerry, please.
I think.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah, you're unmuted. Yeah.
Hi. Great introduction, Joel. Thank you very much for that. Fascinating material. Quick questions. I do agree with Daniel's points on inequality. I wanted to ask, because your description seems very apt in terms of the oligarchy and the clerisy and even of the serfs, but are they the cause? Are the oligarchy and clerisy hand in hand? Are they the cause of pauperization? or are they the survivors of a unproductive and stagnant system? Do they actually keep people down? And in relation to that, what about the working class? Are they serfs? Where do they fit in? As class does seem to be back on the agenda more than ever before. And where does government or the political class fit in? Are they just hand in hand with your oligarchs and clerisy, or are they those people, in fact? Or do the oligarchs and clerisy, are they the state in its new form? I can see it in terms of political suppression, but I'd just like clarity on that. And lastly, very sympathetic to your view of how bad environmentalism in terms of holding people back. But I do think there's a massive problem with your, maybe it's, I haven't read the book yet, I've ordered it, it hasn't arrived, but you've inspired me to read it, with your points about hypocrisy, because surely if people are obsessed with saving a non-human world for a non-human reason, then hypocrisy simply means that stop the top, doing what they're doing in flying jets to Davos conferences, and then we should still get on with fighting to save a non-human world for a non-human reason. And I would think that's pretty problematic if we want to argue for more.
Okay, thanks, Kerry. Thank you very much. We've got a Nico.
Hi, Joel. I'm really enjoying your thesis. I'm interested in, and we've talked quite a lot about, not economics per se, but you've referenced Marx quite a few times, and I'd be interested to know what your economic explanation for this is, because in a way it is quite like the late 19th century in the United States with the, carpetbaggers and the robber barons and so on, and the early part of the century. What's your thesis about why this is happening? And secondly, I'm interested also in the Democratic Republican Party inversion. And Thomas Frank, who I'm sure is a mate of yours, talks about how the professional class has become much more powerful and shifted dramatically to the Democratic Party, whereas the Republicans were, back in the day, the party of business, of the upper middle class, and so on. Whereas the working class or blue collar workers have tended to move more towards the Republican Party, and obviously Trump in particular. And also, there was a very nice editorial op-ed in the Telegraph yesterday, where Dominic Green characterized the Democrats as a gerontocracy pouring the oil on the fire of racial grievance, which you've talked about. The creepy oligarchs, the creepy oligarchs of big tech, that's Jeff and all the rest of them, the servile jesters of the corporate media, and the periwigged aristocracy of the never Trumpers, which is Hillary Clinton and all those below her. I just throw that in because I love the language, and I
do too.
How you saw the Democratic Party today.
Yeah, I could certainly deal with that. Yeah, that's great.
Good man. Sorry to make you scribble these notes down, Joel. Right, we have Tony Pace.
Right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Joel's going to get a bigger sheet of paper. Okay, Tony, crack on.
Okay. Yeah, my question is about democracy in relationship to growth and cities. I've read your book. It's a great book. I found it shocking because I didn't appreciate just how rapidly and how far the change in structure and destruction of cities, and also the increasing disdain for democracy that you point to in the book. You give good strong evidence of how millennials in particular, how disdainful they are of democracy, which is quite shocking and frightening to someone from my background. Now, this raises a number of questions, and unfortunately, you tend to conclude. My one criticism of the book is you conclude it very suddenly, very quickly, and you say that in order to answer all this, we need to have more engaged citizens and understand how one should behave. And you started in your talk tonight, what you said tonight about the alternative systems of education and exposing contradictions. That's good. But what do are you planning another book? It seems to me a sequel should be expounding all the positives about democracy and how democracy is essential for us to live in cities. I know it sounds strange, but you know, you point out that cities themselves, not just the suburban middle classes that are decaying and being prevented from growth, it's all of us, and cities in particular, the form, you know, what you've specialized your studies in, are really changing rapidly and dissolving. You have to ask the question, what is a city for nowadays, unless we're really pushing for democracy? So I'm asking you, is your next book going to be about expanding the positives of democracy and how we can rebuild our cities?
Very good. This is buying a book before even it's been written or proposed. Very good. We got Alex next, please. Alex Cameron.
Thank you. It's a straightforward question, but I've yet to come up with a sufficient answer, and I'm hoping Joe will help me out on that. And it's around this idea, who are the principal drivers behind these ideas? Because in this and lots of other discussions and stuff I've read, it seems to flip from one group in society to another, and the more emphasis placed on one than another, or more on the next than that. So, for example, are the tech oligarchs driving this? The postmodern academics, or the new political activists? Because it strikes me that the ideas that are being discussed in your book, the ideas that are being discussed quite widely at the minute, precede all these people by decades. So I'm just wondering how you might try, please, and enlighten some kind of answer to that question.
So who is behind these ideas? Okay.
Yeah. Can I go for one more, Joel? Or are you already laden down? Yeah, well, we'll take Daryl's iPad, please.
No, I'll answer, not my iPad.
Hi, Daryl.
Joel, thanks. I first know of your work through speaking about the suburbs. I'm a built environment professional, so I just want to see if there's a spatial dimension to this kind of reorganization of classes. And I think going on from what Tony asked, the city as a bastion of free exchange of ideas, have we moved on from that concept?
Very good question.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much, Daryl. Okay, Joel, I'm afraid I'm going to see if you can round up on these.
Well, let me start maybe with what Daryl and brought up, and also Tony, on the issue of the sort of geography of what's going on. You know, one of the ways that we were able to have upward mobility and people living a better life is during the well, in Britain between the 20s and 30s, and then later on in the 1950s. There was quite a bit of building, creating new communities. We did this obviously in the United States on a massive scale. This allowed for the middle and working class to achieve a decent quality of life at a relatively low cost. What we've done now is the cities have become so expensive, so overpriced, so much of the elite's money is there that it is no longer a place where families can be. I mean, what I find really interesting is how little concern urban planners have on the question of whether families live in cities or don't. It just, you know, in a way they want that, you know, that $2,000 a month UBI person in a tiny apartment, you know, smoking a joint, playing video games and watering their plants. That's their ideal urbanite. Well, that is not the ideal urbanite that Aristotle wrote about. It wasn't about living better. It's sort of like being warehoused. And part of it, sometimes the Greens will say, well, then you'll use less energy. Well, of course, you know, if you just lay in bed all day, you don't use a lot of energy either. I mean, the reality is that the cities as they've developed are no longer places where of upward mobility. They're actually very poor, highest inequality. When I worked on a project in the UK, London had both the very rich and the very poor. And we don't seem to be concerned with maintaining families in cities. I was just talking to a former student of mine in San Francisco right before this, and she was telling me stories about, you go out in the street and somebody's shooting meth right in front, right on your doorstep. You have people, defecating on the streets. Can you imagine having two young children like she does, and having that as your environment? So we've been electing in some of our cities insane district attorneys who essentially will not prosecute almost any crime short of blowing somebody away on the street. If you are in San Francisco, your car gets broken into, forget about the cops even saying, well, okay, you can file a report. So what we've forgotten is that to have the freedom of the city, which I've written the history of cities myself, you have to have order. You have to have some notion that I can walk down the street and not be accosted. And of course, during the disorders this summer and now continuing, we have a law, for instance, here in the state of California, where essentially you could steal up to $1,000 with no felony concerns, and you're never going to go to prison. Well, if I talk to my Indian friend who owns a liquor store in Fullerton, this isn't such good news for him. He said people can just go in and they just have their calculator and they're saying, I'll just go up to $1,000. My former student in San Francisco told me the exact same story. So, we have to have an idea of what is the city for? And I think the city is it's got to be a safe place. It's got to be a place where families live. I loved many of the evocative notions of Jane Jacobs. But the Jane Jacobs city doesn't exist anymore, particularly in the core city. She would write about, for instance, Chelsea in New York. I know you have a Chelsea in London, but the Chelsea in New York. This wonderful ballet of the candy store owner who watches after my kids and the extended families. When she was in Chelsea, it was heavily Italian. There were lots of extended families, and people worked in the port of New York, and had good blue collar jobs in many cases. That New York is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. It's college students. It's what we call trustafarians, people with trust funds. I think Simon Cooper, writing, I think it was in The Guardian years ago, said that New York and London are places where the 1% marry each other. And so that idea of the city as a place where you come and make it in the future is just not there. If you don't have a wealthy parents, you really can't do it anymore. And I think that is a tremendous loss for what the city was about. And I don't see anybody concerned with it. Cities are increasingly run by lunatics. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. They're run by people, who aren't interested in jobs, aren't interested in manufacturing, aren't interested in the kids actually learning in school. So what do you think happens? The people in middle class and working class families, they move to smaller cities. This is one of the great options we have in this country. And because of COVID and the increased use of digital technology, it's more and more possible. The massive movement of people out of New York, San Francisco is quite profound. And these cities don't seem to be interested. And in some ways, I've read in numerous, particularly progressive publications, maybe we'll get rid of the rich people and the city will go back to being, sort of, the New York of the 1970s, where you had Needle Park. I guess that was a better era. But the fact is, the purposes of the city are being undermined. So one of the projects I'm involved in right now is what kind of new cities can we build? You know, I did spend some time in some of the newer cities in the UK, but I think that there's really, you know, Milton Keynes in particular, but I think that, you know, we're going to have to develop new kinds of cities. Many of them will be 30, 40, 50 miles from the historic downtowns, because people will be able to work either at home or near home, and maybe we can get it right there. Because right now, one of the other factors that nobody talks about is because people can't afford to pay the rents in cities, they drive up. The people who would have bought a home 20 years ago are still renting, and because they're renting, they're driving up the cost of housing beyond anything that working class people could afford. So hopefully so there is a spatial dimension in America, and we're seeing some of it in Europe. People are opting to go to a different geography to find the kind of middle class environment they wanted. I will answer.
That was a very thorough answer, Joel. So if you yeah, I'm afraid I might have to kind of cut you short on answering the remainder, which was about, you know, who's in control and all the rest of it. If you can just go through those final questions, if you would, and then we'll take the remainder.
Okay,
hands.
Just in terms of the Democratic Party, the transformation of the Democratic Party, which I worked for the Democratic Leadership Council. The Democratic Party is what my friend Fred Siegel calls the coalition of the overeducated and the undereducated. It's the well-educated clerisy and the tech oligarchs are the basis now of the Democratic Party. And what they do is they wave the bloody shirt of racism to try to keep the minorities supporting them. And the Republican Party, its only hope now is to become a middle working class party. But the only way that will work is to get rid of Trumpism, because of the fact that the majority of the American working class in 2030 won't be white. And you've got to learn how to communicate with that population. And then the question just very from Kerry about the oligarchs, did they cause it? No, because they don't have any consciousness about causing anything, and they would never see themselves as being cause of the danger. Are they the survivors? They're survivors of a game that they now increasingly structure so only they can survive. The Obama administration refusal to and previous administrations to address the idea of antitrust and monopoly is one of the major reasons why we're in this situation now. I hope that was quick enough, Austin.
Yeah, sorry, Joel, to pester you on this, but
that's okay.
I've got 6 hands up here. I'll just take them in order. There's more appeared just now, so I'll have to stop at where we're at the moment. So first up, we have Sally Millard.
Okay, thank you. That was really great, and your book is brilliant. I have read it, and it's so jam-packed full of detail. Really, it's a really interesting read. My question really goes right back to one of the things that you said right at the beginning, where you said that the protests of the summer, BLM, and the recent protests at Capitol Hill were two sides of the same coin. And yet you've then gone on to really describe how one side of that coin, I suppose the BLM, have the general support of the clerisy, right, whereas the other side of it really don't. And I just wondered if you could really, because they're both were from a similar generation, so I don't think you can explain it from that point of view. So what's really different, and how do we get those two differences? Can you explain that a bit more?
Okay, great question. Thank you. Michael Owens.
So my questions are to do with the typology and the idea of neo-feudalism. And I suppose, you know, if this is a warning, I'm interested in what's the clarion call, if you will. So, you know, based on the analysis that you've got in the book, and it is brilliant in its detail, how would you see the opportunities to raise productivity? Where would that come from? And linked to that, the third estate, you know, comes right at the end of the book. But you know, if we were to look for a new third estate, you know, what's the basis for the formation of a third estate today? So it's kind of, you know, it seems to me that, you know, you kind of serfs, but who else? You know, who's gonna line up together against the forces that you've outlined? And I'm just intrigued, right? Because, you know, it's a kind of fun analogy. It's a great, you know, kind of an analogy. But I'm wondering, you know, when you were writing it, where did you think it fell apart as a way of thinking about classes today?
Very good. That's a PhD student's question to a lecturer. Okay, who we have? James, please.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Mr. Kotkin. I read a lot of almost anything I see of yours online, I read, and it's very valuable. And I just wonder if your outlook is overly pessimistic due to focusing on California and being in California, and are you projecting California to the rest of the US and other parts of the world or the West? I know just a few minutes ago, we're already talking about some other developments in other parts of the country. And I know from reading you, some of the more interesting things you highlight are how some of the areas, the Midwest, which, you know, which might be of interest to people in the UK as well, to sort of see that there are regenerated areas in the US cities where there's been, including the tech industry, growth in jobs. And there's also some interesting, you know, social developments of the working class. I think if you, to simplify and talk about demographic groups, I think it's quite interesting to see how Hispanic, Asian American groups, which were reflected, I think, politically in the election, you know, and how some of them are clearly not devoted to the Democratic Party and were quite willing to vote with the Republicans and break from that kind of thing. I mean, even in your California, I thought it was very interesting how the vote for the affirmative action was rejected. In particular, again, those groups I just mentioned, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, voting against that. And so, yeah, I guess just as you're being provocatively negative in terms of neo-feudalism, I wonder if I could turn that around and sort of say, if you could say a little bit about what might be positive and some good potential.
Very good. Thank you very much. Dennis and Barnie. And all. Are you there?
Hello, can you hear me there?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah,
yes,
I can
indeed.
hear you.
Oh, hiya. Yeah. Thanks very much for that. I suppose you could say I'm from the blue collar end of the spectrum, looking at this with a smattering of politics behind me. But I'm kind of, I asked the question: if you took all the money that Jeff Bezos and the oligarchs and all of them had and spread it across society, or even American society, how much good would it do for American society? I'm not an economist, but my thinking is that it wouldn't do a lot for all the wealth that they have. Yes. And so the problem is, you know, the old Marxist problem, as you might recognize, how to raise the level of production in society. And it seems to me that that's the one question that's kind of left out of the whole sort of discussion. Not only in relation to the problems that we face in the contemporary world of fighting for free speech and fighting for basic freedoms, you know, to discuss and debate with each other, which are very important and the essence of what it is to be human. But when you present yourself as an advocate of free speech, for what purpose? It's okay to say, yeah, I want free speech, but to me, there has to be a purpose. And when you present it to the world, it's a purpose that serves the interest of somebody. And it doesn't serve the interest of the clerisy. It doesn't serve the interest of the oligarchs and probably a whole strata of the middle class who are imbued with a kind of anti-democratic, anti-rational sentiment. But it can serve the interests of a lot of other people. A lot of them supported Trump, as it happens. Yeah.
Yes, true.
And you know, the problem was there seemed to be nobody that was able to put an argument to those people that would make them recognize what a moron that Trump was in terms of their interests, or you know, inability to meet their interests, but that we should be able to throw up some people who can put this together into a logical argument that serves the interest, and I mean the material interest, because raising the level of production in Britain and America is the problem that we have if we're going to raise the level of culture of our society. And you know, that to me is the big problem that we have.
Very good. Thank you very much, Dennis. Sorry, Joel, I'm going to take 3 more. I know you're writing furiously, but has to be done. So Penny, please.
Hi.
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 The mysterious Penny.
Yes, sorry. I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about cities, and I recognize a lot of what you're saying, but I would concur with the person that said there's a danger that we generalize too much from these patterns. So in the UK, people talk about gentrification now, and they talk about it in relation to everything, and my students just assume that everything is gentrification, and somehow the categories get in the way of us actually looking and observing carefully at what is going on, because somewhere like Dundee, we could do with a bit of gentrification. We don't have any of it. So so I think that's one thing that's important, but also in terms of as a way of looking at the world. I heard Jodie Dean talk about this recently, and she was sort of saying, well, if we're going towards feudalism, that's capitalism eating itself, and that's an opportunity for us. And I know she talks about being a communist, but it seems like I'm slightly worried that it actually becomes a useful framework to understand things that are different, but it doesn't challenge any of the sort of ideological problems we have. And the ideological problem that I'm particularly interested in is this idea of us as victims, whether you're talking about the working class or anyone else. I don't know whether it's a similar discussion in America, but in the UK, there's a lot of discussion about modern slavery. And I was discussing it with my daughter today, and there doesn't seem to be the capacity to really look at the world and understand what it means to be exploited. In other words, you're free to sell your labor, you're free to withdraw your labor. It's a contractual arrangement that you've entered into with somebody else. And that's quite different from slavery, and it's quite different from being a serf. And I suppose this is some of the thing you're talking about people being encouraged to be passive. But I'm wondering whether there's a danger by calling us all serfs, that we're not really getting to the nitty-gritty of what the real relationship is. And exploitation is a much better relationship than serfdom, as far as I'm concerned, because we are free and we have the potential to transform things. So it's the agency aspect of things, which I think is kind of underplayed in this analysis. When it goes from looking at the world to the potential to transform it, it somehow falls short. And I'm interested in what you think about that.
Very good. Thank you, Penny. So I got what somebody else has just crept in. So we have 3 more, I'm afraid, still, but we have to stop at this. So we have Martha next, please. Martha, are you there? Martha, I have seen you several times.
Hi.
Okay, Martha's disappeared. Okay.
Oh,
hello. Hi, Martha.
Hey, Joel. I'm coming here from Richardson, Texas. So I have a little bit more of an I own a home actually here in Richardson that feeds into J.J. Pierce High School. I consider myself like one of the lucky Americans out there. Do you think it's time for a third political party? Do you think that it could really gain traction coming up, or is it just because right now I see the third political party in this country is China, you know, and I think that's so, and I'm interested in starting that and running for office because I'm 32 and I can't sit back anymore. You know, you have to be the change that you want to see. And I want places to be like Richardson. I want places to be like Texas and have the things going on here. So yeah.
Very good, thank you. Martha, remember that name. Remember that name. You saw that here first. Okay, we have John Fender and then Jan Bowman. That's it. Or Teresa, I don't know which one. Both of you are there.
Therese, it's me.
Therese, hi.
Sorry, I did put my hand up a lot earlier on. I seem to have got disconnected. Simon Sharma recently, in being asked about the Capitol riots, quoted Orwell and Arendt and ultimately said, this is what happens when you don't have a consensus on truth. So this is looking at things from a different angle. How much do you think, you know, everyone having their own truth, relativism is actually possibly a root cause behind a lot of this? Because we've had the feeling hegemony for such a long time. And now here with the pandemic, people are saying, oh, we need more counsellors to deal with everyone's distress of the pandemic. When I would have thought we needed more critical reasoning skills, more problem solving skills.
Thank you very much, Trace. And final point or question, whichever, from Jan Bowman, please.
Can you hear me?
Indeed.
It was a great book, Joel. I loved it. It was very grim, and I just thought I wanted to say something about, you know, something about what to do about it. Because I think if you could have said more, you would have said more at the end. So there's not much. You don't say more. So I think you're a bit pessimistic. You have a right to be, I agree, but I think that it's worth looking at just how the things that are on offer today. I don't think that video games and shopping feed the soul, and I think that environmentalism doesn't feed the soul either. And I think there's always people who, in any society, in any situation, have had something in their experience, in their background, makes them dissatisfied with the existing answers and prepared to be looking for something new. So I think that that's going to continue, and it's not going to stop despite all the awful things that you describe in your book. And I also think that the populism of Brexit and the populism that gave rise to Trump, I actually find quite inspiring. I think that our job really has to be to give democracy, I think, as you mentioned in the book, some more meaning and to re-inspire people with what humanity could be. And I think that kind of approach, what humanity could be and what democracy can mean, which I think people don't have a clue what democracy means anymore. I think you're quite right in your book to talk about like a pre-political situation. In that sense, I think you're right about calling the working class serfs. They no longer have an idea of themselves as a class, either of themselves or for themselves. And I think that a re-establishment, a re-understanding of democracy and repopularization of democracy would lead to a much more conscious and active majority of people that could actually change things. So I think we should positive side to what's going on to counter the grimness of your excellent book.
Thank you very much. Okay, Joel, lighten up, will you? So look, you've got a hell of a lot of questions there. I'm sure you can't tackle them all, but give it your best shot. We've got maybe 10 minutes or so.
All right, well, I'm going to do the best I can. First of all, I want to thank you all just in the sense that you're making me think a lot, which is really useful. You know, several people said, well, you know, shouldn't you write another book about how to get out of it? And you got to get past my wife. When I wrote this book, she said, you went into your office for 6 months and didn't come out. You know, and, you know, I've got kids and, you know, a wife and a dog, and, you know, writing another book would be a problem. Plus, to tell you the truth, publishing is not what it was. You know, I think Austin could back me up on this. You know, the advances aren't what they were. The publishing companies, I'm not necessarily sure that mainstream publishing companies would even publish a book like this anymore. We know we've been seeing people who don't buy the party line, having a harder time. But just in terms of what to do, which is I really like, I do think that there was something positive about the about the support for Trump, not Trump himself. Had Donald Trump been something more of a human being, it would have been much better. But I do think also with Brexit, there is, and some of the negative votes on EU throughout Europe, that there is a grassroots rebellion. I am working on a piece for Quillette about that grassroots rebellion, and I do see something good about it. I think that what we really need to be thinking about is, the question of productivity I thought was very good. I just finished a study on reshoring of industry in the United States. And it's happening overwhelmingly in the middle of the country. Many of the people involved in it are worried that the new administration will impose regulatory issues and tax issues, make it hard. We have many areas where the skill sets don't even exist anymore. I was talking to a company actually originally that came from France, which was trying to do PPE. And they said there were certain things you just can't get in the United States anymore. The skills don't exist. And I have to say, and I don't mean to sound negative about the United Kingdom, but you guys are further along in deindustrialization than we are. I think that it seems to me that doesn't even seem to be, the Tories don't seem to care whether you have any industry. I guess they think, like our leaders in California think, the tech oligarchs will solve everything. I guess the people who run England think that the people in the city of London will save everything. Obviously, that doesn't work. It doesn't spread jobs. Here's some positive things. One of the things we're beginning to see is with 3D printing, that industries that went offshore for low labor costs don't have to go offshore anymore. The pandemic has shown us how important it is to have better supply chains. I mean, think how dependent Britain is now to food imports. I mean, that you should be able to produce more things. I love London, and my wife used to live in London, but try to buy something to bring home to my kids that's English. That was hard. I mean, what am I going to get? What was made in the UK? Not very much. So, but we have an opportunity, and we also have an opportunity. An industry I'm working on now is the space industry, which the United States is still pretty predominant. Building airships is going to be something that will require working class skills, unionized labor, as well as rocket scientists, and we're seeing thousands of jobs being created in the Long Beach area, which is south of Los Angeles, where we do create industries. Medical instruments, another industry, which could create a broad spectrum of jobs for people if we promoted it. The good news in terms of politics is that, for instance, in the state of Ohio, you have Senator Brown, who's far out on the left, and Senator Portman, who comes from the right, sponsoring legislation to encourage the manufacturing of PPE and other essential equipment. I think that countries have to give up the idea that globalism works wonderfully if you're just transferring money around. It doesn't work so well for the people on the grassroots. So I think the new technologies will allow us to do things in these countries, in our countries, that we couldn't have done before. And we also have to rediscover our workplace. One of the good things of being a reporter, and I'm an old-fashioned reporter, the hardest part for me about Zoom is I don't get to go and see, go visit people in Arkansas. But I did an interview in Ohio, and they couldn't find welders. They took, their welders are now almost all women. He said, why can't a woman be a welder? We had Rosie the Riveter. British women participated in industry during the war. There are ways that we can create new opportunities for middle and working class people instead of bringing everything to China, or for instance, where the Chinese will eventually, they'll automate everything too. And that's happening to some extent already. Why can't we build the Bay Bridge with American steel? Why did we have to import what turned out to be defective steel from China? Why can't we look at this? So I've been trying to work on it, and you've chastised me correctly about a lack of a upward or forward agenda. What I am doing as we speak is doing that for the state of California. This is my home. I still think it's the most interesting piece of real estate in the world. We still have amazing legacy, amazing technology, very obviously a very diverse population. I think that trying to figure out how we do it, education is a big part. We've got to be able to educate kids so that they actually have a skill and a career. One of the terrible things we see now is some school districts in California, they don't even give you negatives for not showing up. They have quotas on who can be criticized for being disruptive. I mean, the more postmodernist lunacy gets into our education system, the harder it will be to reverse these changes. But the realities are there. The realities are that with technology, with a better education system, we can create a whole new world of opportunity, for working class people, but also for some of those left behind cities, whether they're in the United States, the UK, France, whole areas that have been essentially abandoned by globalism. These places could go back to life. They offer affordable quality of life. They're sometimes in very attractive areas. And they have a residual. When I interview CEOs about why they're moving, reshoring to, let's say, Ohio, they said this place has a history of producing. They see a value to it. I don't know how this will work in New York. My grandfather was a manufacturer, and the other one was on the other side. They worked in the factories as union labor. That New York is well and gone. And can we replace those jobs with artisanal jobs? Just on the oligarchs, people say, well, you need Uber and Lyft because they've got the technology. Why couldn't you, with these same algorithms, have a taxi company in every city in this country that is locally based, that uses the same technologies? There's no miracle about what Uber was able to do. Was by accessing endless amounts of capital, they could lose money for years where their competitors couldn't. Same thing with Facebook. It's that access to capital. If we were able to spread capital more to smaller companies, and if we prevented the accumulation of every interesting new startup by a handful of companies. I think there were years in the book where Google would acquire 10, 15 companies in a month. We can't have that. Lastly, to my fellow American in Texas, and I spend a great deal of time in Texas. I'm writing a feature about Dallas right now. I think we do need a new party, because I think if the Republicans go in the Trumpista direction, and that's all we do, it will be like the National Front in France. It will get 35% of the vote and lose every election nationally and most elections locally. On the other hand, going back to the old, sort of country club Republicans, well, they don't have any members anymore, so that would be difficult. And the Democratic Party, as an old Democrat myself, now an independent, but the Democratic Party has abandoned the middle and working class almost completely. And a third party would be great. The question is, where's Abraham Lincoln when we need him?
There you go. Thank you very much. Who said you weren't positive? Look, I think it's a terrific presentation, Joel. I second everybody who says it was a great book, as are all of your books. But this one is particularly apposite for today's condition. I think who was it? Penny, who was talking about feudalism and making the point that actually under feudalism, we didn't have agency, whereas one of the good things about modernism, or modernity at least, is that we still do. And so that level of distinction, I think, is very important. And similarly, looking for the positives, those tech oligarchs, they may be screwing us over, but they've given us Zoom and given us the opportunities to converse across the continents to enable us to have this conversation in the first place. So, more fool them. We take advantage of it where we can. And I thought that those kind of connections are really important. And I think the anecdotes that you've given us, to be honest with you, even reading the book, some of the stories that you've given us of life in America are worth their weight in gold, because I didn't have that level of insight from reading articles or seeing, TV. So thank you very much for all your in-depth analysis, for your generosity of time, and for writing a terrific book, which I urge everybody to get hold of if you haven't already. And even though we haven't answered all the questions, I think they can float around there. We can carry on this conversation more broadly in Zoom or on other occasions. But can we unmute and just give Joel a huge thanks for his time and efforts?
Thank you.
Oh, terrific.
Fantastic session.